Good morning, everybody. Our mission statement encourages us to nurture lifelong spiritual growth. And frankly, I'm a little surprised at 82 that my own spiritual outlook continues to morph and to grow. And nevertheless, this agnostic finds this later life spiritual perspective that I'd like to share interesting enough to share with you this morning. We all know that reality is much more fluid and complex than the dualities that we use in our normal thinking process to compare and contrast and sort stuff, like the binaries of friend or foe, masculine or feminine, or large and small. And yet, we often come to think of these polarities as not only opposites, but really oppositional. And lately, I've been reimagining a few pairs of my own value system as if they were more of a continuum of contrasting viewpoints instead of an irreconcilable pair of polar opposites, and reweaving them to cultivate a common ground between two polarities is more interesting and meaningful to me, and we can enrich the meaning and value of both ideas and therefore entertain a bit more of the whole truth if we put them together. And this morning, we have time to illustrate how this process works for 5 of the examples of these pairs of ideas that we normally think of as simply opposites. And first is the polarity of the sacred and the profane. As a Catholic, I learned to expect to be spiritually inspired in sacred spaces like this one, as we indeed are, by a ministerial team and by each other. For example, I will never forget sharing my time and energy together with Scotty. But we do hang out beyond these walls 98% of our time in the ordinary, profane, and secular world. And therefore, we have much more opportunities outside these walls to seek out and be inspired by admirable people who move us. It might be the work, insight, or attitudes of a dear friend, or an inmate, or a hospice nurse, or a child. Another overlap of the sacred and profane is our reactions to the tsunami of new scientific research, for example, about astronomy and the natural world and quantum mechanics and biomedicine. My personal response to these new discoveries is most often a sense of awe and wonder and mystery, which I normally associate with spiritual emotions. And sometimes even scientists use words that certainly sound spiritual to me. John Kabat-Zinn, a molecular biologist, and Sam Harris, an atheist and cognitive neuroscientist, when expressing their most profound, direct experience of reality, often use words like indescribable, unfathomable, mysterious, and even occasionally miraculous. So the sacred and profane inter-are. And second is the polarity of self and others. Since we're skin encapsulated, each of us is primarily feeling separate and unique. But every human, including every one of those 140 humans, are closer to us than 50th cousins to everyone else. And so we're members of an extended but real family of billions of strangers. And in the more developed world, each of us are 100% dependent upon the labor and creativity of tens of millions of strangers. And that's because they provide virtually all of our education and information, employment, transportation, markets, governance, medical care, and certainly more than 95% of our food. Marge Piercy's poem, To Be of Use, ends with this line: "The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." I personally aspire to remain healthy enough to gradually use myself up by being useful in some small way to some few of my stranger cousins. And we'll see about how that intention plays out. But I know that the biggest challenge to that aspiration of service is my consuming self-centeredness, which is always my primary obstacle to further lifelong spiritual growth. And I believe that my willingness to be of use to others will only endure if I can manage to perceive each stranger as family and as more similar to than different from myself. Third is the polarity of us versus them. Now, I happen to be a committed political lefty, a former socialist to boot. And in our ultra-partisan time, after every conversation I've ever had with a political conservative, I've realized that neither one of us have changed our minds one whit. Not ever. So now what? Well, what I can do on my spiritual path is to slowly learn to change my mind, not our minds. I can learn to reduce my disrespect, my self-righteousness, and my smug superiority that has characterized my political stance, and keep in mind that my staunch liberalism is certainly not the whole truth. And one more thing I can do to reduce my personal animosity around this political competition. I can remind myself of the wisdom of a spiritual teacher and former social activist in the trenches of a dangerous civil war. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "Our enemy is never human. Our enemies are greed and hatred and ignorance." The fourth polarity is that of humans and the more than humans. Every once in a while, it's useful and humbling and therefore much better for all concerned for me to set aside my superior role as human being and just delight in the unique, special gifts of other species beyond my human experience. And last fall, I spent a few joyful minutes with a pair of 250 to 300-pound hogs, a sow and a boar, in their muddy pen in rural Polk County. They were more unconditionally friendly and affectionate to this stranger than any adult animal I've ever lived with, and there's a lot of them. In the moments when we chatted and leaned against one another, I became a vegetarian. Finally. The philosopher of science, Melanie Challenger, writes, "This is a difficult thing to admit for some of us, but the truth is, being human is being animal. And not just that we're part animal. Thrice a day, I get to walk Chica behind the house, which is a landscape surrounded by hundreds of mature trees that spellbind me." Poet David Wagoner writes, "If what a tree or bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still and let the forest find you." And the final polarity we'll speak of this morning is gratitude and grief. Lately, I'm finding more pleasure in perfectly ordinary days because I'm taking my life much less for granted now. And I do notice that my everyday experience becomes more interesting to me when I'm more interested to begin with. Simone Weil said that attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. And gratitude for my life seems to grow with age. C.K. Chesterton wrote that the way to love anything is to realize that it might be lost. But I'd like to be able to diminish my own concern about my future death. An ancient spiritual teacher said, "You can't help anybody if you're afraid to die." I realize now that the polar opposite of death is not life, but simply birth. And the two bookends of birth and death to each of our lives are terribly important, and we all know, everyone in this room knows, that the latter will carry great grief. And yet, both birth and death seem relatively much less significant when I compare them to my gratitude for the gratuitous gift of our full lives. Wendell Berry says, "Accept what comes from silence. And what will come from my silence, finally, now, would be a co-parent of our 7 kids and my best bud for 43 years, Christina."
Oh boy, how can I keep from singing? Whew. Yeah, we've been lucky for 43 years, a little bit longer actually. So, it is winter 1963 in suburban Detroit, in the house where I grew up. 5 hours before my mother died of cancer in her own bed at age 56. This is what she said directly to me. "I want you to go to church every week for the rest of your life." What? I felt gobsmacked. Mother wasn't a weekly churchgoer or ever a religious woman. My rebellious 21 years of life flashed before me. No option B here. Then, as if gently and firmly guided by an unseen being, I said yes. For the next few weeks, That yes dogged me like a puppy. Eventually, I discerned a kind of metaphorical church for myself. I would find ways to behave like the best part of church, which for me basically means finding and joining good people, doing good work. It also meant for me, yes, and. Maybe I can inch forward into this preposterous aspirational intention to honor Mother's life sentence after all. I'm still inching forward. So Jeremy, if you would put up the UU values, I'm going to tell two stories that I think illustrate how these UU values can show up in our everyday lives. For most of the 1960s and 1970s, I loved making umpteen varieties of bread for my family. I began offering bread-making classes in many settings, including schools. My model was simple. We all make bread together and learn other stuff too. Examples. Students write out recipe terms, spelling. Triple the recipe, math. Proof the yeast, chemistry. Use whole grain flour, botany. How civilization changed bread making, history. Bread sculptures, art. A teacher friend referred me to a special ed teacher who wanted me to spend the day with her 3rd and 4th graders making bread as a hands-on activity. Okay. It was spring in northeastern Ohio. My plan for this class was to make bread in a bas-relief lamb shake from this very book, published in 1975. And it would have the head, ears, feet, tail, and spiral cinnamon rolls for the lamb's wool. I made this recipe many times, so I was confident about the process. As I was carrying in my supplies to the classroom, I noticed this special ed class had 8 differently abled students, a teacher, and 5 busy aides. Oh dear God, why didn't I know this ahead of time? I thought it was learning challenges alone. My confidence suddenly crumbled. Orthopedically impaired classes represent 3 major categories: neuromotor impairments, degenerative diseases, and musculoskeletal disorders. An array of assistive devices, such as wheelchairs and oxygen tanks, lined the wall. Ay, ay, ay. The exuberant welcome of the kids somehow helped me continue. And they helped me set up the ingredients. I decided to trust the process. What a concept. As I began the bread-making instructions, I didn't even need to ask for helpers. Those kids knew who could do what. Oh, I'm so moved just thinking about them now, and it was a long time ago. So my knowledge and their wisdom equaled a very fine we. First, we needed to triple the recipe. They all knew Lamar was a math whiz. He confidently multiplied recipe fractions in his wheelchair. Morty held the wooden spoon like a scepter with both hands. He was clearly ready to stir the ingredients. When the dough was ready for kneading, I heard, "Psh, Susie can do that." Susie was called back then a thalidomide baby. Some of you remember. She was born with no arms, the result of a now banished drug prescribed during her mother's pregnancy. Susie appeared at the bread bowl, telling me to roll up her t-shirt sleeves. She kneaded the bread with her shoulder stumps, announcing, "I could do this." Of course she could. And so it progressed with grace and awesomeness. Latasha's muscular disorder movements were extremely slow. So we all decided she could safely use the knife to dice orange rind. Mary's spasticity was different. She had shaking movements, rapid shaking movements, perfect for mixing the jar of cinnamon and sugar. That team of teachers and aides believed deeply in those kids and themselves. The students and I were learning so much more than just facts that day. As the bread came out of the oven, one of the aides said, "I'm never eating Wonder Bread again." That was a big deal in the 70s in that crappy town. "This smells like real food." And as I was packing up my supplies, the lead teacher beamed. She said to me, "You know, the 5 of us had your back the whole time. That is what we do here. None of this is easy. We need each other." All UU values were there in that classroom that day. And now I have another story, a prison story. The Alternatives to Violence Project, or otherwise known as AVP, began offering workshops in Coleman Federal Prison in Central Florida after 9/11. I volunteered hundreds of times in the women's camp and the men's penitentiary. A few times I was lucky, and Ned and I worked together with the men in the pen. They called him Uncle Ned. Woo, high praise. One day, Ned and I were getting things ready at home for AVP with the men. Ned placed the Beanie Baby satchel on top of the pile. You remember Beanie Babies? My reaction was heinous. I said to Ned, "Really? Beanie Babies with these dudes?" Ned reminded me that I had already packed a children's picture book. This book is exactly the book that I used to take to prison, the one I read this morning with the kids. And I told him when I brought children's books, picture books, the sharing was often very movingly deep with the men. Okay, Beanie Babies back in. The second day of the AVP workshop, when the group began to coalesce, we spread all the Beanie Babies out on a table. Pick a Beanie Baby for now, guys, and then rejoin the circle. The men walked quietly over to the table as though it was an altar. Almost reverently, each man chose a Beanie Baby. The silence felt holy in the men's penitentiary. Back in the circle, we asked the 25 guys to talk about the Beanie Baby in their hands. One of the men began sobbing. The guys sitting next to him gently put their hands on his back. He then settled down as his homies told stories about their children back home, about being a grandfather behind bars, about how heartsick they were apart from their families. We went through most of the Kleenex supply that morning. All 6 UU values, and then some, happened that day with the men in that penitentiary. Those men need an accepting community, just like us, and a safe, supported place to be honest and vulnerable, just like us. So much grief, shame, and regret for lives gone off the rails. And maybe a Beanie Baby now and then to begin to work towards redemption. Transformative experiences are possible for all of us if we stay open. So let us be open to what life offers together. There are good people doing good work in the most unlikely places. May it be so.